Good morning, Gina. How are you?
Good morning. How are you? I'm great.
I'm so looking forward to this. We were just chatting for a couple minutes, and I think we could have probably recorded part of that because this is going to be a fun conversation. I had saw your post on LinkedIn about your ESOP that you just did with your Ace Hardware stores, and Steve Sorkin, who is a mutual friend of ours, had liked it, and lo and behold, here we are. So
Perfect.
I love it, and God bless the social media world for various reasons. Let's give the listeners a high level overview of where he came from, and then we'll go back and we'll unpack the whole story.
Sure. Literally where I came from is Ohio. I grew up in a small town in Ohio. I moved to Washington, D.C. in
Which one in
1993.
Ohio? We're in Ohio.
Louisville in
Louisville.
northeastern Ohio. Do you know it?
Okay. My business partner's out of Dayton.
Oh, okay. So I went to school at Wittenberg University in Springfield, which is not far from Dayton.
Oh
So,
yeah, nice.
yeah,
That's awesome.
lots of like degrees of separation there. Um, yeah, I couldn't wait to come to a big city, and I ended up in Washington, and I've pretty much been here ever since. I opened a hardware store, my first hardware store in 2003. I had moved to a neighborhood that had been destroyed by the riots when Martin Luther King was assassinated. It's a beautiful neighborhood, but it had really just, it sat dormant basically after the riots destroyed the neighborhood. And around the mid 90s, a lot of people started moving back in because it was cheap. We could get houses here and condos
Mm.
here that were really affordable. Most of them were boarded up. I was working in the tech industry, basically a tech reject. I kept getting laid off. I think I've heard other of your interviewees say the same sort of thing. And I decided one day I wanted to do something very practical. So I was going to go from software to hardware, which is what I did. I opened my
And a
first
different
store.
kind of hardware, right? Like it's
Exactly. Yes.
not
Nuts,
servers.
nuts and bolts, hammers and nails. Opened my first location. Ace Hardware is a co-op, as you know. So we did some research with the various co-op options. Joined Ace, and my husband joined the business about 3 months after I opened, and we've been business partners ever since. 13 locations, almost 300 employees, Washington, Baltimore, and then a couple of the suburban areas. Yeah,
It's so yeah, I mean that yeah, like, there's and that was super easy and it happened in a couple of years, right?
piece of cake.
Yeah, a piece of cake. Everybody should do it. So why I want to go back to the researching and the co-op because I want to get into like a bunch of topics, kind of just to set the stage of like why ESOP from other options when you finally made the transition. But then you integrated things like the hardware recovery program, which is also tied to some of the stuff you talk about. And there, I want to tie into a lot of the whys and your culture stuff, but like even before any of that, like going from software and you're doing this research, why did you start looking at co-ops? Why hardware stores? And how did the origination story actually take place?
Well, hardware started really, I needed a job. I mean, it's as basic as that. And there were so many streets and houses in this neighborhood, it's Logan Circle in Washington, that were boarded up. And when I moved into this neighborhood, I actually cried. My real estate agent said, "You have to buy in Logan Circle. It's the only place you can afford." And of course, now she's the smartest woman I know because she is the reason that I became, an owner in this
Intriguing, yeah.
amazing neighborhood. So I moved in and got involved with we were dating then, so my then boyfriend got involved with the community association. And the community association's sole purpose at that point was to get rid of the drug dealers and try and attract residents and businesses to this neighborhood. And so we would hear what was going on and what people were asking for. And all of us wanted to be able to dine and shop and recreate right outside of our front door. I mean, just
Hmm.
like every strong urban community wants. We
Hmm.
didn't want to get in the car and go to the suburbs to go to a big box store to buy home improvement needs, which was the dire need at that time because of all of the boards on all of the windows. And so
Hmm.
I'd like to think it was just this lightning bolt that hit me that said you should open a hardware store. But truthfully, for about a year, I had been going to these meetings, listening to people say, "Gosh, I wish we had a hardware store." We hear that in lots of ways in our lives, right? I wish somebody would do this. I wish somebody would do that. And one day I just said, "Why can't it be me?" And I reached out, like I said, we reached out to, so there are no hardware franchises. A lot of people don't know that. So all of the independent hardware stores in the country either buy from a co-op or they buy from a wholesaler. And there's really you have to buy from somewhere, just like any other retailer. When you buy from a co-op, you have a lot of support that you don't necessarily get from a wholesaler. So just as an example, the use of the Ace brand, some shared marketing expenses. I think Home Depot's marketing TV expense is something, at one point it was like $300 million a year in TV ads. Aces is $30 million a year. It was, that's been several years. But my point is it's very small but it's a lot bigger than Gina Schaefer's TV budget would be.
Yeah,
So by
exactly.
joining the co-op, we have a chance to aggregate purchasing power so that we can buy better, advertising power, training opportunities, all of those things that come along with being part of a larger organization that give us as independent retailers a competitive advantage, or at least a leg up.
So interesting. Okay, so I would love for you to give a quick overview of like what a co-op is and a little context behind this. Gina, is I got a really good college buddy who is now up in the middle upper management of, is it NIACS or NICS? Vern is it's this big. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's a big co-op, and he wrote this book called Rewired about the co-op model. Learned a
Yeah,
bunch about it over the last, like, handful of months, and I would, like, honestly, I was so ignorant from it, it was just shocking. So, give us a little bit of your definition and kind of the mechanics behind it, because I think it's super interesting.
sure. I mean, you're right. It's fascinating, and a lot of people don't know about it. In fact, most of our funding, ever since that first location, ever since our second location, we have banked with National Cooperative Bank. So, up until the 70s, banks would not loan money to cooperatives because there's not one single owner. It's a
Mhm.
collective ownership model. And so banks wouldn't fund co ops, therefore, they couldn't grow. And most people have heard of like housing cooperatives or grocery cooperatives, farming cooperatives, et cetera. And then there are things like purchasing co ops, which is what ACE is, what True Value was, Do It Best, if you're familiar with Do It Best. And so the federal government chartered National Cooperative Bank so
Hmm.
that co-ops could gain more footing in the corporate world and be a good viable option. You know, think about today kind of the fight that B Corps have to get
Yep.
national standings. That was what was happening in the co-op world. So at its foundation, a purchasing co-op is a collective purchasing tool for independent retailers. It gives ACE the opportunity to go to a vendor like Milwaukee, for example, or Black and Decker or DAP, and negotiate on behalf of all of the ACE retailers so that we don't have to go do that individually and those vendors don't have to put up with us
Mhm.
individually. So
Mhm.
I often tell my new hires, if I went to Black and Decker and I said I want to buy some drills, I'm only going to need 100 drills, right? And they're going to charge me X price. If
Mhm.
Home Depot goes to Black and Decker, they're going to want
Right.
thousands of drills and they're going to get a much better price.
Mhm.
ACE does that negotiating on behalf of about 5,000 ACE retailers. So
And then
that's
the ACE retailers are the owners of the co-op, right?
correct.
So, it's so interesting, like,
Correct.
the customers are actually the owners.
Yes, exactly. So when we, every time we open a new store, we basically get another share, another membership share in the cooperative. And so we are the collective owners. Now, there is a corporate office in
Mhm.
Oak Brook, Illinois, outside of Chicago, and they have all of the requisite corporate departments, but they effectively work for all of us members. The other interesting thing about a co op that a lot of people don't know is that cooperatives do not have to pay taxes on profit that they dividend back to their members. So at the end of the year, I get a dividend from Ace Hardware that's it's based on how much I buy from them. So the more loyalty I show the co-op, the bigger my dividend, and then they don't pay taxes on that as profit. So they can use. So for example, I served on the Ace corporate board for 9 years, which is a whole other conversation. But we implemented an SAP software package. Took us about 5 or 6 years. It was $75 million, multi-millions of dollars at the
Mhm.
time to
Mhm.
do this program. So the cooperative had the ability to use profits for that kind of corporate advancement, but then anything after that, they dividend back to us, no taxes paid on it. So it's a really great business model.
Well, and, like, you're just getting your customers excited to constantly do business with you, and that's where, like, I learned, and I won't go down this rabbit hole too much, but that, it's NIACS or something like that, but essentially they're like a technology provider for energy companies, and then I realized that, like, as you was telling the story, I'm like, "Oh my god, the people that they're helping implement are the owners of the business," so they're, like,
It's
working
so
with how to
great.
design. Yeah, I'm like, "This is ridiculous," and so I'm curious, kinda going back to, as you decided to go with ACE, and why did you decide to, like, how, like, that first store, and, like, I mean, you own how, like, as you said, 300 employees now, and there's, like, more than 13 stores, I'm assuming, but, like, how did you decide to become like an entrepreneur instead of just a store owner? Like, and how did that conversation take place?
Well, I think we'll get to a little bit of the ESOP and exit strategy in a bit, but it's interesting. When I opened that first location, I was probably in business for about 6 or 7 months when people started coming in and saying, "When are you going to expand? When are you going to
Oh.
expand?" Which is super exciting and really terrifying, right? I was fairly young. I was super green. I mean, Ryan, I didn't know. I I had worked in retail once in college, and it was like a summer stint for 2 months in a jewelry store or something. I mean,
Mhm.
I had no retail experience, no HR experience, no hardware experience. So I was really just I was treading water, trying to figure out how to run this business. And people started saying, when are you going to expand? We had letter writing campaigns from other neighborhoods in the city, like physical letters that would show up in the
Wow.
mail. We had phone calls. We had lots of newspaper articles. It was really, really exciting and also terrifying because there was a lot of pressure for us to get big. And I don't know in hindsight if I ever planned on having more than one. I know my personality, I would have gotten bored fairly quickly. But the fact that people immediately started asking was crazy, now that
Mhm.
I think about
Mhm.
it. So the second store, I was actually working as a cashier at the first location one day, and a guy
Yes.
walked in. Yep, and I love being a cashier. I had a guy walk in and he said, "Hey, I have a building 2 miles across town near Georgetown University. Would you be interested in looking at it?" And I was like, "What the hell?" And so I went to see it.
Love it.
Yeah, I went to see it and I signed a lease, probably a month later. I mean, it wasn't a long negotiation process. And so 2 years to the day that we opened the first one, we opened the second one. By this point, my husband had joined me, and then we opened one a year after that. There was so
Wow.
much demand in the city. The big boxes weren't in Washington at that point. They
Okay.
didn't like the city. They couldn't fit in the small neighborhoods with the row house style stores. So they
Mhm.
couldn't get the footprint that they wanted, and they didn't see Washington as a viable market, which
Hmm.
I find shocking. Ace actually didn't see it as a viable market either. They thought I was crazy, and they also didn't think I would be successful. But there's there at the time was we've grown tremendously, 650,000 people here, and like three hardware stores in the whole town. Three tiny hardware stores, not even
Why?
like
Why? What's the deal behind that?
I don't know. Like historically, there was a crime in DC, and it wasn't the magical place that I think it is now. But there were still lots of people with plenty of money, with plenty of fixer upper challenges.
Mhm.
Um, I find it really shocking now. I do. Same thing happened in Baltimore when we opened in the Baltimore market. Not one big box within the Baltimore city limits. There still is not a big box hardware store. There's a Target, I
Right,
think a
right.
Walmart,
Mhm.
but no big box hardware stores. And when we opened, I think there were three mom and pop hardware stores. That's it in the whole city. Also 650,000 people.
So interesting, and as we get into your growth journey, because like you said, we're going to get into the exit and why you chose that and how that all came to be. But I want to talk about some of the stuff that as you're growing, Gina. I mean, after putzing around on your speakers page and some of the things that you talk about from like the culture was such a huge thing, and I don't know like where along this journey did you shift your mindset to say, hey, instead of being a store owner, I'm going to be building something that's beyond me, from the and you started ingraining some of these things like the hardware recovery or then the shopping local. You know, was there a point where then you started to like grasp on and say, hey, that I'm going to be more intentional with these focuses, or were those things kind of slamming you in front of the face too? Like you're like, oh, that this is just a thing. Kind of curious on the shift of how you started ingraining some of those themes and be free to elaborate on those themes and what you were doing.
Sure. It's always great when you can pinpoint an exact moment when you had this epiphany and you become a real business owner.
I sense a little sarcasm in there, right?
I might have one or two of those, but I don't have many of those. So maybe there was some sarcasm. I do remember. So I read the E Myth early on. Somebody handed me the E Myth, and you probably feel the same way. You can read a business book, and if you just take away one little nugget that sticks with you, that book has served its purpose, right?
Mhm.
And when I read the working on your business, not in your business, it stuck. I have a terrible memory, and that just stuck in my brain. And I realized that I could love being a cashier, which I do, or I could love stocking shelves, which I find really fun, or I could figure out how to grow a hardware empire in a city that desperately needs hardware. And when I made that mentality shift after reading that book, I would say it was probably full speed ahead. I was, however, smart enough to know that I was still an idiot. And I say that, I mean, with all respect, because I know we've built a great business. I immediately hired a business coach to help me figure out what the next steps had to be. And one of those next steps corresponded with needing to put a manager in charge of the second location. So a lot of, I can pick on hardware because it's my industry. It's an old, established family, generational kind of
Mhm.
business. I didn't have a dad or a grandpa who handed me my store or sold me their store. So I had to figure it out without those guys telling me what to do. And I knew that I couldn't be in two places at once. So at the time, this would have been around 2005, 2006, the ACE statistic was that about 50, I hope no one quotes me on the percentages, but about 53% of the store owners only had one location. Nothing wrong with
Oh, that makes
that, but
sense. Yeah, that seems like a reasonable.
single
Yep.
store operations. And if you talk to a lot of those folks, they would say, well, I can't because I don't trust anybody to run a second store, or I can't be in two places at once. I mean, nobody
Mhm.
can, right? It's physically impossible. And so I really took to heart the fact that if I was going to expand, I had to figure out how not to be in two places at once, but to believe that I could still make this work. And and again, it's great in hindsight. The concept of recovery hardware had started in 2003. There is a drug addiction clinic right down the street from my hardware store. And a young man came to my store one day and he said, I'm from the clinic down the street. I've been clean from drugs. I think it was like 2 months. He was very early in his recovery, and he asked me for a job. And I said, I don't need anybody. I'm not hiring. Long story short, he ended up working for me, and we're friends to this day, and it's wonderful. And he just opened a restaurant. But I trusted him from the very beginning. There were a lot of things that hiring somebody from what would be considered a non-trustworthy background, putting him into a position, watching him grow, watching him fail, watching him leave. He left after 11 months and said he'd never talk to me again. We were a terrible place to work. I mean,
Oh, wow.
we
Yeah,
joke
yeah.
about it now, but what it made me realize is that you could trust somebody from a very different background than my, small town Ohio background. And if you trusted who you hired, you could be in two places at once because someone else would be there for you. And so that's a weird example because Shane didn't end up being that person at that point. But what happened is he left mad and started telling everyone at the clinic to go see that lady at the hardware store. And I didn't know this. And so people just started showing up asking me for a job. And so I hired his.
Wait a second. So he's pissed. He leaves and
So pissed.
he's bitching about you, but yet
Yes.
everybody is coming to apply for a job.
Yeah.
Where's the where's my disconnect here?
He called it, what did he say to me? He said, I left in a self-righteous indignation, I think is what he calls it. But when you go through recovery, you have a lot of time to reflect and probably a
Hmm.
lot of therapy. And he had a lot of time to think about the foundation that he got, or the safety that he felt by having a place to go every day. And regardless of how much Mark, and my husband's name is Mark, regardless of how much we sucked as business owners at that point, because we were just so clueless,
Hmm.
we gave him a safe place to come every day where he really was happy. And
Hmm.
so he left to just really work through all of the other important things he had to work through.
Yep.
But he started telling all of his friends that he had this 11 months of support at the hardware store. And it's called a
Oh,
recovery job.
yeah.
Um, and your recovery job for someone coming out of a rehabilitation program is your first job that you get out of recovery. And it can really make or break your recovery. I figured that out,
Hmm.
in the years since. And so he was telling his friends, hey, go see Gina for your recovery job. And so he sent me Mark, who actually is an executive on my team now. Mark sent me Scott, who ran a store of mine for 10 years. Scott
Wow.
sent me Brian, who struggles to be clean and lives in South Carolina now, but we're friends to this day, and on and on and on. So to go back to your question, I feel like I'm talking
No,
to big
I
people.
love the context. Yeah, yeah.
We realized that we could be across town if we built this foundation of trust. So I hired a business coach and I said, how do you build a foundation of trust? And everyone in the world probably knew this at the time, but you really just solidify your core values. You take what you're already doing, you articulate them, put them on paper, you train to them, you hold people accountable to them. And then as you grow, you move those core values with you throughout, all of the other locations. So this is, I think, a great example. The fourth store that we opened was in Baltimore. Baltimore is 30 minutes from Washington, 30 miles from Washington, about an hour drive. I wasn't going to be there every day. Hell, I wasn't even going to be there every week.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to even if you could.
No, absolutely not. But we had these core values in place. The manager who we were sending up there to open those stores with us knew how we like to operate. He lived and embodied our principles and values. Hell, he actually probably helped us create them. He was pretty early in that process. So we felt very comfortable when he went to Baltimore that he already knew what we expected of him. You're going to hire people in recovery. He was in recovery himself. He got it. You're going to embed yourself in the community and act like the owner of the store. He actually did have a small ownership stake in the store. So that was like legitimately true. You're going to hold community events. On and on and on. All of the things that we thought were making us successful in Washington, he was able to take up the train line to Baltimore and help us grow.
That's amazing. So I have interviewed so many people that they struggle doing that with it, like the trusting in someone to be able to take and run their company or their vision or division. And I mean, these are like highly successful, highly paid people that don't have a recovery background that they're not trusting.
Right,
and I
right.
actually, and I actually interviewed this woman, Gina. Her name is Allie Taylor, and she's got a PhD in the psychology of business owners. And like literally, she through her dissertation, she found that the ability to let go like will literally double your company because like when she saw people let go and like actually let go of control. So
Yep.
like how do you like any words of or like words from your experience of like how to deal with that issue just as a control freak business owner that's trying to let other people take and carry part of their vision?
So Mark and I talk about this a lot. I think at our core, he and I are both very trusting people. So that's very helpful. I mean, and I say this
Yep.
with no disrespect for somebody who's not trusting. You have to find a therapist or a coach if you're not trusting, because you're right, you can't grow. And that's not a trait that you might have had a horrible past, or you might have had people do terrible things to you. I get why people don't trust other people. But if you want to scale or at least be successful in some way, you have to figure out how to emotionally get past that. I used
Mhm.
to say that if I'd hired people I didn't trust, I'd hired the wrong people. So I think there is something to that too, but it's really a balance of,
Mhm.
can you make yourself trust people? Can you get to a point where you are trusting? And then can you learn how to hire people who you trust so that you know you've done it right? Interestingly enough, one of my long-term employees who's in recovery sat me down one day and he said, "You can't hire people anymore." And I was like, "What? I'm the boss. What do you mean you can't hire people? I hired you." And he said, "You hire everybody, and it's not always good." So
I love it.
I say that to say there's a downside to that, right? That I was fortunate enough to build a culture where an employee trusted enough that he could say that to me, that he could say, "No more."
Mhm. Mhm.
So I don't know if that answers your question, but I
No,
do
it
think
does. It does, and I think there's, for a different topic for a different day, but I think the whole trust thing, it's a like I'm similar to you where like I'll trust and then get screwed, and then I'm like, oh, that
yeah,
didn't work out. But like, I mean, honestly, I have so people like, oh, you have so many amazing people around you, and I'm like, it's because I went through a lot of really not so good ones, and these are the ones that stuck. But it's like to me, the process is still worth it to find the good people. I don't know, and maybe you could
it's
get
so true.
cynical over the way, but
It's so
Um,
true.
so then one of the other things that you had spoken a lot about is the community and the urban living and buying local, and explain how that theme arose throughout the journey as well.
Yeah, so Washington is a lot like any other city in that each neighborhood is kind of like a small town, right? We have main streets through each of the neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods have a strong name and identity. And you don't
Hmm.
cross town to this other neighborhood. You think this one is better, worse, sketchy, whatever. So I grew up in a small town with a strong main street. I like to travel to towns with strong main streets, and often if I'm giving a presentation, I'll say to my audience, close your eyes and think about a place that has a main street that has affected you in some way. It might be a favorite vacation spot, a place where you've lived. Now imagine it all gone.
Mm.
And I mean, I get like, I don't know, my hair stands up, I guess,
Uh-huh.
every time I say that, imagine it's all gone, because that's why I get up and fight against big boxes every day, or antitrust laws, whatever it is, because I want our communities to still have a vibrancy and a safety that a main street provides. And if that's
Hmm.
gone, I mean, maybe I'm just not smart enough to envision it, but what's left? I
Well,
don't
a
know.
bunch of stock buybacks, and I'm sorry,
Yeah,
I will hold back from my rant.
that's probably a
No,
topic for another day too.
yeah, right, but no.
But that's how that started to become really important to me. I mean, I really believe even in big cities we can maintain a community, excuse me, a community-based feel, and visually a main street, because neighborhoods really are safer when storefronts aren't dark and when people
Mhm.
can walk in and meet the person running the store or the person at the cash register. So
That's
it's
so
important.
It is, and it's interesting. I live in this place right by. I'm actually right in between this place called Stillwater, which is
Okay.
this river town, and it's got the main street, and there are 0 standard box franchise buildings, and then it's Woodbury, where, like, you name the big box shop, it's, like,
It's
there,
there.
and it's so important, like you said, because it's the velocity of money. You want your dollar to go to the business owner that then goes to the employees who then spend it in the community. I mean, it's truly actually an economic, like the velocity behind money is so
Totally.
damn important. How, as you're growing, Gina, like, you also started talking about, I can't remember which blog it was, but it was like, the three things. It was the trust and then local, and then it was like thinking about your exit strategy. Where along the lines did you start going, what do we do next? Like, and why did you ignore it for that thought for a while? And then when did it hit you in the face that you wanted to start exploring it?
Well, it's a really good question, Ryan, because the first question that people were asking is where are you going to expand, and the second or third question was what's your exit. I mean, I was like 36 years old building a business, and people were already saying, how are you going to get out? I'm like, what? And it wasn't hardware people, because hardware people are lifers. Like, those guys knew that when you opened a hardware business, you were gonna be there until the very bitter end. And I hadn't been in hardware my whole life. I'd been in nonprofits and these tech companies, and so I never really thought about it as a lifelong business. Most leases for small businesses are 10 years, and there's some options. And so Mark and I used to joke that we would open a store once a year for 10 years, and then the leases would come due, and we'd close the store once a year. I mean, we realize in hindsight how
Yeah,
stupid
yeah,
that
just kind
was.
of like,
Yeah.
that
But when
makes
people
sense.
started saying, what is your exit? We would tongue in cheek respond with the 10-year strategy, because I just thought at the time, why are people asking me what my exit is when I'm, so young and I'm still building this business? But I did realize probably about 10 or 12 years in, and this is just as I became more savvy as a business owner in general, that a lot of people don't plan their exit until it's too late or until it's too uncomfortable or too stressful. And I at least wanted to start thinking about it. I also get I get bored fairly easily. And I would say, because I have such a strong team that truly does 98% of the work, I needed a purpose. And if my
Hmm.
purpose was to figure out the exit, I was going to do that earlier rather than later, so that then my next purpose could unfold, whether it
Hmm.
be, speaking or writing or consult, whatever. I mean, I'm sitting on a beach, I have no idea yet.
Hmm.
But, so it was probably, I mean, we're going on our 19th year, I guess. It was probably around year 12 or 13 that Mark and I seriously started talking about it.
So where did those conversations lead you? What resources? What was kind of the milestones of knowledge, bricks, the foundational bricks that you were gathering along the way?
Well, probably in its infancy, our first mentors were hardware store owners, our friends, our peers who were transitioning into the business from their parents. And so we started watching how that was working, the good, the bad, and the ugly, because we've seen it all at this point with familial transitions, which, I mean, you may know a little bit about, but we don't have any children. And so the transition to our kids wasn't going to be a possibility. Our nieces and nephews are young, they live far away. That wasn't going to be a possibility. So then our first conversations were, do we have a manager or an employee who we think we can transition the business to? Which we never actually ruled out until kind of the bitter end, when we decided to transfer it to all of the employees. And
Hmm.
so we looked at that. We started talking to some folks who have sold to PE firms.
Hmm.
What does that look like? How does that feel? What are the pros and cons of that? Ace became the sole owner of the largest Ace chain. It's probably been,
Interesting. So the co-op bought
so the
the.
co-op, yeah. So we had it's Westlake Hardware. They started in like the Kansas City area. And when that business got big enough, they sold to a private equity firm. That was before the last recession. And as you know, private equity firms typically want to keep their holdings for 5 to 7 years, and then they want to exit. Well, at that point, there was a real fear. They had grown so big. I think they were at 90 stores at that point. The fear was a competitor to Ace would swoop in and buy them, and we would lose a big chunk of revenue because they were such a big customer to the
100%. Yeah,
co-op.
yeah.
Yeah, so the board resolved that we would use some of our profit, the members' profits, to buy that group of stores. So they have in a very interesting way acted as a roll up for stores that want to retire and don't have an exit. So they've purchased stores in order to fuel their growth.
Yeah.
So we talked about that. Would we sell to Westlake? Would they want us? Would they want to be in an urban market with all the nuances that we have? Is there another local owner that has the appetite for growth? We eventually got to a size where we felt like it would be really hard to find a single owner in the
Right.
hardware business who could just, I guess I
Write the
had the
check or
foresight.
even do the seller financing or whatever it might be,
For all
right?
of it. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, right.
exactly. Exactly. Our leases are all over the place.
Yep. Yeah. Well, and what's okay, so many interesting points of that is one, like the co-op of Ace. I'm so like is was before that big 90 store roll up with the private equity firm, which again, I like that sends alarm bells to me for like the co-op model and how different the model of internal rates of return for the limited partners of the private equity firm. That's their mandate, period. And it's
Yep.
so opposite than the co-op that they allowed that to happen. So what in the like corporate docs or like whatever it might be to the Ace franchise or not the franchise, but the co-op like said what you guys should or shouldn't be doing for exit or transition plans? I mean, like, did they have any say or thoughts in that?
No, so prior there was
So,
nothing.
so interesting.
Absolutely nothing. I mean, we're independent businesses, right? So if you decide
Okay.
tomorrow you
Yeah.
want to buy a chain of 13 hardware stores, I have 70% that I could sell you. Um,
Hmm.
the rules changed after that transaction. If an owner wants to leverage money, so this is really interesting and it's been fantastic for our growth. So I told you that we get a dividend at the end of the year.
Hmm.
That
Hmm.
dividend gets given back to retailers, the members, in the form of stock or cash.
Okay.
The stock is the biggest portion, and
You get to choose or do they
no, you
allocate
don't get
set?
to choose. It's
Okay.
like a 60-40 split or whatever it
Okay.
is, 70-30 split. Um, the stock piece stays in a fund. It's kind of, I call it a forced retirement fund, and you can't access that money historically till you die, sell, or close. So it just
Hmm.
sits there. And unlike stock on the stock market, it does not appreciate. Whatever it is when the day goes in is what it is
Oh,
14
interesting.
years
Okay.
from now. Yeah. So there was no way to unlock that value. And those of us that were growing needed better access to capital. And we were growing these buckets of money that was technically ours that we couldn't access. And so the board at that time, when I was on it, adopted a program whereas you could borrow against your stock
I
if
was gonna
you
say
were
margin loans. Here they come.
awesome.
Yeah,
Awesome. So we have
that's
the
awesome.
ability to take that stock money, use it to open a new store, and then pay ourselves back with our future stock money.
That's fantastic. That's awesome.
So to answer your question, once we put that into place, the membership documents changed. If we were going to borrow money from ACE, they were going to have first right of refusal to purchase the store.
Okay,
It
makes
doesn't mean
sense.
that they're going to, but it also could potentially take that private equity player off the market or a competitor off the market. If you've loaned, I mean, you have to have taken the money from ACE in the first place for
Mhm.
them to, have. Actually, it might be I don't think it's in all the membership agreements now. I think it's only if we borrow that money. But
So
regardless,
yeah, yeah, it
there's a
makes
little
sense
more of a
though.
safeguard. Yeah.
So then, super interesting. When you were going through those different, like, private equity versus internal transition, and that makes sense too, as you got too big that someone's not gonna, not gonna be able to structure the deal, to the side to the price that you need. How did you like start viewing the valuations with each of the exits? Like, did you start going, okay, like how are companies valued, and like specifically Ace, did the co-op and corporate have any kind of like baseline framework for you to make that decision? Then you're viewing like the different options and the prices that they were offering.
That's probably the biggest education I've had, and I still feel like I don't understand it all. I mean, Mark functions as our CFO, and thank God he knows the
Hmm.
numbers and understands that stuff. Everyone values things differently. Are we valued based on revenue? Are we valued just based on assets? We have the nuances of the multiple leases. Does that devalue because they're all over the place and cause work, et cetera, and so on? We've purchased so we have one store that did not work that we closed. So we've had 14 over the last 19 years. Of the 14, we've purchased four. So we had a chance to experience firsthand how you value a business in decline, how you value a business bigger than any of our other locations. We worked with a third party evaluator to give us
Okay.
their opinion. Obviously, the sellers always have an opinion and some sort of formula we ask them to provide. And then just based on experience and what we know, the profitability will be in a high occupational. It's expensive to operate in the district, and so we always have to take that into play. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's kind of all over the place.
Well, no,
Um,
it does, Gina, because most people like there's no easy way. And here's like one of the myths that we've been trying to bust through is that "Oh, well, I only know what my company's worth when I decide to sell." I'm like, "Well, that is ridiculous. So you're never gonna know what your house is worth until you decide to put it on the market? Because
Right.
like, so there's wait, and I'll give some context to this, and then I'll layer over the question with it. Because is that in our intentional growth principles, there's 5 of them. The first one is like, what do you want and why personally? And the second one is your financial targets and understanding your ideal income, annual income, your net worth, and then the value of the company while you own it. But if you're not gonna sell, it has to be valued based on the risk of your cash flow, essentially, and that's
Yep.
it. And until there might be a premium paid by, like, by Home Depot if they bought that from, bought the '90s stores, or a private equity firm that's got a different play that they're doing, but somehow it's gotta start on this financial level that's just mechanical in nature. But the question behind this is, and more of like, and maybe also a comment, is that because it's so ambiguous, I want every business owner to be able to go, I want this. This is what it's worth, and here are my options. And because of my culture and this and that or the other thing, I'm willing to forego the 800 grand premium on the strategic buyer than I would on something else. But quantifying what's important to them as it relates to the value, and it's hard to do that if you don't know what the things are worth. And it's
People are
so
afraid to
just
talk about it. Yeah, they're afraid to talk
yeah,
about it. Yeah.
right.
Two of the stores that we purchased, the owners would not give us, they would not give us a sale price. They said, make me an offer, which is one, incredibly frustrating, and two, very stressful because you should know what your business is worth. And there are lots of formulas, right? I mean, it could be a multiple of EBITDA or it could be straight asset. But you can give us that number. You can say, okay, I've decided I'm going to value my business on 3 times EBITDA, and this is what that number is. Boom, you know what it is. But to say make me an offer only puts us as the buyer in a position to, one, be insulting, which
Right.
we never want to do, right? Two, look like idiots, which we also don't want to do. Or three, overshoot.
Which still wouldn't work out because then you overpay and then you got to make it work after the deal.
Yeah, absolutely. Or the bank won't fund
Nope.
the loan. So it is very interesting how people are afraid to either, one, do it, two, believe an outside evaluator,
Mhm.
or like go through those steps years in advance.
Well, and going back to the concept of what do you want with you in the business from the intangible personal side, and then tying that to the financials, I think about this becomes more and more difficult for business owners that have specific core values. Like, I mean, your hardware recovery and the things you're doing in your community to align all of those values with a buyer that's willing to pay the price that you want is almost damn near impossible sometimes.
Impossible.
And
Yep.
so, like, how did you handle figuring that situation out along the journey, and then how did you start pulling on the thread of learning more about ESOPs?
So for the four that we purchased, we eventually, had an outside person give us a valuation, and we said, take it or leave it. This is what we're going to
Mhm.
offer.
Mhm.
But we could very specifically say, this is a multiple of EBITDA or assets, depending on the deal. And so we felt very educated in our approach to making that offer. So it wasn't just a, we're gonna, pay you X
Mhm. Blank
because
check. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, let's be realistic about it. So we were in the process of evaluating all of these things, and we went to New Belgium Brewery, which is in Fort Collins. It's a Fat Tire brand, and I was there for a meeting with some ACE retailers, actually my peer group. And there was a young woman who gave us a tour, and Brian, she was bouncing off the walls. I mean, she was so excited to give us this tour, partially because she also got to tell us how she was an owner of that damn brewery.
That's awesome.
They were an ESOP, and I think they sold a couple years ago. I think they actually did sell to private equity, but at the time they were an ESOP.
Mhm.
And so, Mark and I left that day thinking, well, my God, if you can infuse that kind of enthusiasm in the woman giving tours, what could we do with our folks in the city? And Mark's first comment was, "There's no way our team can afford it," which, regardless of how short-sighted that might sound, in some situations,
I'd say there's got to be a lot of people that just nodded their head to what you said.
correct, correct. And we didn't understand how they worked at all. So we tabled it. We didn't whatever. And then I met Steve Sorkin on a panel, and he was talking about the employee ownership exchange and ESOPs. And I came back to Mark and I said, I think we need to revisit this. And the very first question we asked was, how do the employees afford it? And he said, it doesn't cost them a dime. And honest to God, there was a checkbox for ESOPs. That was the first check that like sent us on our
Yeah.
path to what got us to where we are today.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the employees don't have to pay a dime, and by the way, the company doesn't pay any taxes
No
afterwards.
taxes. Fantastic.
Wait a second. Like, tell me more, right? I mean, you have
Sounds
to
a
be
little
kind
magic.
of
Yeah. Yeah.
so, describe how long did the ESOP education process take you? I mean, like, and what were there any barriers for you and Mark that you guys had to overcome?
So it took us, I think it was probably March or April of 2020 when we seriously started putting pen to paper and figuring out if it was going to work. And
Can I pause you there for a second? So
yeah,
April 2020, after the world shuts down, all the big box shops are still open while I don't
yes,
know whether you were mandated to shut down. So like nothing going on and you're just, hyper focused on this ESOP thing, right?
yeah, right. It was exactly like that, Ryan. I went back to, I couldn't be a cashier. I was a runner. We were considered essential, and I'm, so
Okay, you're still
incredibly
open.
grateful for that. And my team was so incredibly grateful to have a place to go. And we don't need to dwell on COVID, but that
Mhm.
caused a whole lot of issues for a small business like mine. One very specific one, which people seem to find funny: no one opens an independent business with enough phone lines to handle a pandemic. So the
So interesting.
phones, this was me with my headset on for the people who can't see me. I was Judy. I was Judy answering the phone at the switchboard for like 7 months at the same time trying to figure out how to plan an ESOP.
That's awesome.
That's
What
how
a
it was.
great story. So,
Yeah.
other than that obstacle, like, what were some of the other things as you guys were talking about this? That were there any hurdles you guys had to mechanically overcome, or some things
I
that you
don't
thought were interesting?
I don't think there were hurdles in terms of challenges. There's just hurdles in terms of the checklist. And so we had to make sure that all of our finances were aligned. All of our stores were independent LLCs. They had to be rolled up to, Mark would be so mad if I couldn't say S or C Corp, but we had to be rolled up into one
Hmm.
company. We
Hmm.
had to find a bank that was willing to fund it. And this was perfect because National Cooperative Bank not only understands co-ops, but they understand ESOPs, and they
Oh,
love
that's
Mark and
awesome.
I, and they're huge champions of ours. So they immediately jumped on board to be our funding partner. And then we had to put together the team. So there's a team that an ESOP is comprised of, which is an outside consultant, an independent trustee who works on behalf of the employees, attorneys for that person. I can't tell you how many lawyers. Everybody had a lawyer. I think my dog had a lawyer. So we had to put together that team, which wasn't hard. I mean, I think there's very few people in the country that are really ESOP experts, and they all seem to know each other, fortunately. So you can,
Hmm.
find the good and the bad out fairly quickly. And so we put together that team. I would say, so we closed on the ESOP deal. We told our team in July. So July of 2021. So that was the time frame.
Wow, I mean, that's a pretty relatively fast time frame, and especially with all the other craziness going on, did you ever think twice to say, hey, like maybe there's a well, I mean, if you're already borrowing money from Ace, I mean, maybe just the fact that they were the first right of refusal, but did you ever think like, hey, strategic buyer, private equity firm, especially private equity in the last 2 years have just pounded on everybody's door that's got any kind of size of a company?
Yeah, we didn't because we love our team so much. I think it became so much more, particularly if you think about 2020 and all the civil and social unrest. So, my office overlooks 14th Street, and almost all of the protests that happened in Washington in 2020 marched right down my
Right by
street,
your office?
right in front of my office. And we would do two things. We would either essentially close the store and walk out on the sidewalk. We would invite our customers and staff to come walk out on the sidewalk with us so that we could participate in the protest if you wanted to, right? Which was
Hmm.
very impactful for our employees who really wanted to and felt like they were stuck in their job.
Hmm.
And we had customers, they felt the same way. They thought it was so cool when an associate would say, hey, I'm going to go stand in the street in solidarity. Do you want to come with me? So it was very moving for us as business owners. Or we would open our windows and we would like shout out the windows, like, I don't know. I
Hmm.
always felt like I should have curlers in my hair. I don't know. I felt like one of those people on TV, like curlers in my hair, maybe a cigarette, like, hey, I'm with ya. Why? That's what
A
okay, now I
great
sound like
picture. I
I'm
love it.
crazy.
I love it.
That was always my visual. Anyway, that made us even more aligned with the idea of an ESOP because we felt like if anything was going to help make a difference in income equality, social inequality, all of this crap that as a country we can't seem to figure out, the ESOP was an answer. And if that was the small thing that Mark and I could try and do, and it
Uh-huh.
might not be, I mean, who knows? But that's what we were going to do.
It is, I mean, my listeners probably get sick of hearing me talk about it because and like, I have no vested interest other than the fact that like it mechanically works and it's a bipartisan like policy. I mean, the business owner doesn't pay or the business doesn't pay any taxes afterwards, and then the employees don't have to pay it, and the employees get rich after time if everybody's growing value. I'm like, I mean, the inequality is like the biggest issue from our economic growth. And it just is
Yep.
amazing how it unlocks everything. And what I find interesting based on what you said at the beginning is like, so the co-op doesn't pay taxes on the dividends it gives you, and then the ESOP doesn't pay any taxes on those dividends. And then like, so the money just keeps rolling down. It's
That's
amazing.
the plan. Yes. Yeah.
That's amazing. So, how did your employees take it? And like, I mean, it's a complicated thing that you probably spent. I mean, listen to you talking about multiples of EBITDA, and you were just a hardware woman back only 19 years ago at a cashier. And so, like, you got there through almost 2 decades of hard work and learning, and blood, sweat, and tears. How did your employees react when you said, "Hey, we're doing this thing called an ESOP, and you're an owner now"?
The reaction was all over the board. I mean, we had absolute blank faces, like, what the hell is this woman talking about? We had so we told our four key back office leaders first, and one of them immediately thought that Mark and I were leaving like that
Hmm.
month, and so we knew right away we had to nip that in the bud. And so that was a helpful reaction from him because it just made it easier. The next group that we told was the 38 store managers and the back office team and assistant managers. And I gave them a speech. It was like 15 or 20 minutes, just like sort of, I asked them to indulge me in a little bit of history and walk them through the path. And I probably cried like 4 times. So I
Oh,
think they understood the emotion of how important it was, with the caveat that I wasn't leaving right away.
hmm.
I have some folks on my team who've worked at ESOPs before, and the next
Okay.
day we traveled around to all the locations to talk to all of the employees. And it was really cool to meet the ones that understood it because they were already helping the younger associates or newer associates understand what it is. It's a really weird concept. It also doesn't mean that you're automatically the boss or you're automatically making more money. There's so much of what it automatically doesn't mean that you have to try and explain what it does mean and what the value is, even though some people would wish that it was those other things, right? I mean, it's a long
Yeah.
term, slow play.
Yep. Well, it's so
Yeah.
interesting. Like you and I were talking about before we hit record that like through our training, I mean, hundreds of people that have gone through it are like they gravitate in principle three to ESOTs because there's so much bullshit out there about what it is and that's not true. And like, the only way I've said it, Gene, is like it mechanically puts zero more risk on the operations of your company than there was before because
Nope.
it's
Nope.
just a cap table ownership transition, not a management role, which is the big
Correct.
problem that so many people have is like they're burnt out, so they want to exit. They want to do an ESOP, and you're like, wait a second, you still have a sucky executive team, and you don't have a strategic plan. Your finances suck. So, like, by the way, it's not going to solve your burnt out misery. Like,
Nope.
this is a ownership value equity transition, and people don't get
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. They don't. Even, Mark and I had to really sit down and discuss what our transition, because that it doesn't solve the transition plan for us.
Hmm.
It just solves the exit piece of it, right? So how does that happen? And I'm technically ready to retire, and he kept saying you have to fire yourself, and we would argue about it. Sort of, I mean, we don't argue much, but he would say just fire yourself. I'm like, well, first of all, that's not a logical response. What is the
That's not a
logical?
plan, Mark. Come on.
Yes. Have you ever worked with a spouse? I mean, you have all sorts of
Yeah,
different.
yeah, oh, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, so then we had a chance to say, well, okay, we need a new CEO in order for Gina to fire herself. How long is that going to take? What do we have to do before we hire a new CEO? Who helps? I mean, so it's
Hmm.
all of those. I call it the adulting that has to happen. I have to be the adult in the situation. Mark has to be the adult in the situation. No one else is going to do it for us. So then we could talk about what those steps are. And if we get to the end and we're successful, and I want to announce to the world I'm firing myself, then I can
Hmm.
do it and be like, it can be a real thing. So yeah.
Are you guys are you still planning on sitting on the board or like what's the maybe maybe give a slight overview of like the board structure and like because you mentioned something that I think is super important to note that your cashiers aren't voting on whether you're going to acquire another building or another business or not like so there is a normal level of control that's held so maybe would you indulge us for a couple minutes.
So typically ESOPs will transition over time depending on the access to capital and what the buyout has to be. And so we sold 30% first. The business will pay that down over the next, how many, it could be 10 years, but hopefully it'll be more accelerated than that. And then the plan is to sell 19%. So we'll still have majority ownership by a couple percentage points. And then at that point, we will put together we will have hired a CEO. We will put together an actual board that we will sit on because then the next step is selling that final
Hmm.
51% when we're completely gone. So it will probably be, I'm guessing, 5 to 6 years before we
Hmm.
get truly to that transition point.
Is there
But
a reason you
that's
didn't do the 100% to begin with? Because
yeah,
it's not
really
that.
just we couldn't get enough we couldn't get a big enough loan for the value of the business.
Got it, got it. That makes a bunch of sense because, the stat out there right now, I believe, is like 90% of ESOPs that are done go 100% because, like,
Wow.
yeah,
I hadn't
and
heard
it's
that.
and again, this is gonna be way more mechanical than most people want to care about. But like when you're just if you're a pass-through entity and you're not 100% ESOP, the tax benefit, if you make distributions to yourself to pay your taxes, you have to make a distribution equal proportion to the ESOP
Right.
because the ESOP is a partial owner. So what happens is people go like, okay, well, I don't want to have this idle money sitting there. But
Right.
it's interesting that and it, but it works out great because it's like it allows people to get that mindset to be marching towards a bigger goal too. What are your hopes for this like long term? I mean, have you thought like what do you think this can be?
Well, I think interestingly enough, the pandemic increased awareness for small businesses. And so I was not necessarily at a point where I wanted to grow, but I think this could be a vehicle for growth for a team that's younger, more energetic, ready to really tackle the next layer of the competitive landscape. So I hope that I hope it's an opportunity for us to acquire more stores, open more locations, but more importantly for the consumer to understand that they need to continue to support Main Street and for us to be a viable player. I mean, that's the thing that freaks me out the most, that eventually people will just stop shopping at any brick and mortar. And then, what happens to my 300 teammates and what happens to the landlords that we're supporting and, the trickle down.
Hmm.
Um, that's my goal, is that we transition out in the next 5 years or so to a professional management team that lives and breathes our values and wants to grow.
You had mentioned that you get bored easy and you also need and are aware that you need a purpose. How are you working on that topic as you're looking towards the horizon?
Well, I got really fortunate. Several years ago, ACE started, it was called the ACE Center of Excellence, and it was a training institute within ACE where a couple retailers, were being paid to provide keynote addresses and training around the country. We have a fairly well known customer service philosophy, ACE does. And so, other businesses wanted to hear about it. I was fortunate enough to be added to that roster. That program no longer exists, but what it essentially did was give me a foray into the National Speakers Bureau and
Okay.
a bigger platform from which to give presentations and speeches. And I really love that. So I'm hoping to do more of that on a bigger level in the future. And then I started writing a book. So one of my teammates, I used to joke that I would call it From Software to Hardware if I ever wrote a book. And then one of my teammates said to me one day, this business is called Recovery Hardware in the community. And I cried. I was so moved.
Oh,
And
that's
then I
awesome.
said, that needs to be the name of the damn book. So I am about 3 months from finishing it. I really hope that not so much that it launches me for anything, but it just helps create more awareness for non-traditional hiring, a way to build back or build up businesses in Main Streets better through
Hmm.
non-traditional hiring practices and more community-based growth. So that's my plan.
That's awesome. And and we will not go too far into this topic, but because everybody's talking about it right now is the labor shortages and
Yeah.
people not coming back, and especially more in the retail and the services base. I mean, how have you seen how your models like handling that compared to other people? Any couple thoughts on the
Yeah, I
situation
mean,
that's out there?
I think it's really challenging, and there's lots. I was interviewed by the New York Times a week ago about, is it a labor shortage? Is it a wage issue? Is it? I think it's everything. Truly, is it a
Right.
daycare issue? I mean, there's lots of research that says that
Amen
when
to
you're
that. I'm in the middle
applying,
of that crap.
exactly, it's a pain in the butt, right? And you probably have the luxury of working from home. You don't have to be at a job because you're the cashier, and so I think it's all of those things. We have historically been really fortunate to be called a high road employer. We've always paid higher than minimum wage. We've
Hmm.
advocated for an increase in the federal minimum wage. We've paid for benefits. And I'm not saying any of that to brag. I'm just saying that we kept adding, new quivers so that everything that was thrown at us, we had like a counter as an
Hmm.
employer that we hoped would
Hmm.
work. It doesn't always work. I mean, we still have, turnover and all sorts of other things. Now we've added the ESOP as another quiver. So I think the shortage for us has been lessened. It's certainly not been as dramatic. Like I have friends that own restaurants that are closed half the time and, had to
Mhm.
cut back on hours and what they do. We haven't had to do any of that.
Mhm.
But we feel it. I mean, I think across the 13 stores, we probably need 10 employees, which doesn't sound like a lot. But when that becomes, 400 or 500 hours of labor a week, we feel it.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And super helpful, and like you said, the arrows in your quiver. I mean,
Yeah.
like you say, I
I'm
love how you say
going to say the
it's
quiver
everything.
arrows. Yeah.
Yeah, I know, and I don't worry, I mess up. I mess up analogies all day long, and I
Okay,
actually end
good.
up saying the opposite by accident. And they're like, "I think you meant the opposite." I'm like, "Yeah, whatever. You
Actually,
understood what I meant, right?"
you got it.
um,
Yeah.
no, I think it's there's a book called Think Again by Adam Grant, and he just says it, things are not that simple. It's not binary. So like actually saying it's complicated, actually people go, yeah, you're right. It is.
It
It's
is.
not just like one thing. It's not the the
Admit
one
it.
answer that we always want to blame, but this has been Gina so fun. I
Thanks.
love to ask two questions to wrap up the call. One is,
Sure.
what does the word intentional mean to you?
For me, I mean, I know it's focused, but I don't sit still. So for me, it's actually sitting down, folding my hands and forcing myself to think about an actual rational answer, decision, plan to something.
Awesome. And then if people want to find you, your speeches, the YouTube, your book, where do they find you?
So right now it's ginaschaefer.com. It will eventually be recoveryhardware.com, but they can find me there. Same thing for LinkedIn. Gina Schaefer is my real name. I mean my name on LinkedIn. And then all of the stores, if anyone was interested in just the, what the stores are doing or what they look like, they're all named after the neighborhood they're in, but they can go to acehardwaredc.com and they can get a list of the locations and just see some of the fun local stuff we do and how we present our brand in the local market.
Gina, thank you so much for coming on the show, and thanks for everything you're doing. I love it, and I'm excited to watch the journey you're about to embark upon.
Thank you. This has been great.